Hey folks, welcome back to the channel. Today I'm going to talk about a transit system that I've long been fascinated with, and that's also been requested probably more than any other system ever. This is a system that is famous, and famously good, much like the Hong Kong MTR, and in fact its name is even similar. It's the Singapore MRT. The Singapore MRT is a deceptive system. It only has 6 lines and 127 stations, meaning it's smaller by number of stations than systems like the Santiago Metro and the Chicago L. Things do look slightly better when you look at track length though, as the MRT has over 210 kilometers of track, that's 134 miles. But where things look truly astounding is the ridership. The Singapore MRT carried almost 3.5 million people every day before COVID, that's more than the metro in Madrid or even Osaka. Most amazing of all, the system didn't open until 1987, making it barely 30 years old. So how does it work and what lines does the system consist of? Let's dive in. If you're not already, consider subscribing to the channel and hitting the bell icon to get notifications. It helps a ton and it's free. You can also support the channel with Patreon or YouTube memberships and enjoy benefits such as early access to videos and exclusive live streams. Now, let's get to the video. Singapore, if you're familiar, is a very unusual country. For one, it's an island nation city-state cuddled up against the southern tip of Malaysia. It has a population of roughly 5.6 million people, and it's also one of the richest countries in the world, which seems like the classic city-state thing. There are a lot of governmental and regulatory oddities at play in Singapore, which makes it a unique place, but this is RM Transit, not RM Political Geography, so I'll spare you the breakdown. That said, it's interesting to consider the MRT as essentially a national railway network, just for a tiny nation. In the late 1960s, Singapore's growth meant leaders were looking towards rail expansion, both for its high capacity and for its small land footprint, which is critical because the country is only slightly larger than the city of Toronto. Now, Singapore is a place that is known for its economic freedom, and so the idea of creating a potentially very expensive rail rapid transit system was not uncontroversial. Fortunately though, the desire to create a successful and high-quality city came before the desire to pursue less expensive solutions. This led to construction beginning in 1983. The first line in the system to open was the creatively named North-South line, which began service in 1987, opening in phases from Yio Chu Kang to Toa Payoh, and then further on to the city center before turning west and terminating at Outram Park. Most of the initial system was underground, with a few at-grade and elevated sections to the north, as well as the system's initial depot near Bishan Station. The next year in 1988, the North-South line was extended west to Clementi, and then later Lakeside. The north end of the line was extended to Yishun. These extensions were both almost entirely above ground. Things changed substantially the next year in 1989 with the introduction of 2 new extensions. The first extended from Raffles Place to Marina Bay and was taken over by a newly curtailed North-South line, while the second, which extended north and then east from City Hall to Tanah Merah, almost entirely on elevated structures, became the East-West line, which took over the tracks west from Raffles Place to Lakeside, better aligning the line's actual routes with their names. About a month later, at the end of the year, the East-West line was extended north at its eastern end to Pasir Ris, again on an elevated guideway. Now, before we talk about how the North-South and East-West lines further developed, surely you're curious how they could be reconfigured so easily. Perhaps they share tracks through Raffles Place and City Hall? As it turns out, the lines did not. In fact, they have a cross-platform transfer, because Singapore planned for all of this, of course. That said, the cross-platform transfer is not basic like Montreal's Lionel-Guru transfer, and instead runs for 2 stations. At first, that seems like a minor detail, until you realize the platform configuration changes from one station to the next. This means you can head in any of the 2 possible directions you may want to go on the transfer line with a quick cross-platform walk at either one of the stations. A year later, after the big network reconfiguration, a new branch opened from the East-West line at Jurong East, though it didn't feature interlining and instead operated as a completely separate line. Later that same year, the East-West line was extended 1 station west to Boon Lay. Both this branch and the extension are mostly elevated, with substantial portions of the branch being at grade. Following this work, a further extension for the North-South line was undertaken that would serve the developing Woodlands area in North Singapore. This project opened in 1996 and extended the North-South line north, then west, then south, forming an inverted U. The North-South line's extension connected to and took over the branch line which split from the East-West line at Jurong East, forming a giant loop. The station at Woodlands offers bus connections to the causeway that connects Singapore to Malaysia. This extension was almost entirely elevated and goes through some surprisingly low density and industrial locales, as well as the town of Woodlands that has since become one of the city-state's biggest towns. In the early 2000s, a new branch of the East-West line was created with service to the Singapore Expo Convention Center starting in 2001 and Changi International Airport, the home of Singapore Airlines, starting in 2002. The station at Expo is notably one of my favorite designs in the world with its spaceship-esque look, and was unsurprisingly designed by Foster & Partners. The extension is above ground from Tanamura to Expo, and then underground from Expo to Changi Airport. While service was initially operated from the airport and Expo to the rest of the line, low ridership led to the branch being converted to a shuttle service, something systems like the Vancouver SkyTrain may need to consider doing in the future. Speaking of Changi International Airport, it's truly incredible and probably deserving of its own video, so let me know what you think in the comments down below. 7 years later, in 2009, the East-West line was extended to the west to Joo Koon with 2 additional stations. 2014 saw an extension of the North-South line underground from Marina Bay to Marina Bay South Pier, bringing it to its current state. In 2017, the last major change to the core lines was seen, with an extension of the East-West line above ground through the industrial lands in Tuas, west of Joo Koon to Tuas Link Station. This extension brings the MRT close to the second link bridge border crossing with Malaysia, and afforded space for a large new depot beyond the terminus at Tuas Link. That leaves us with the North-South line and East-West line as they are today, forming the core of the MRT network. The North-South line has 27 stations over 45 kilometers of track that are mostly above ground for a wide station spacing. The North-South line serves Marina Bay, the downtown core, sometimes called the Central area, the Woodlands, and Jurong. The East-West line has 35 stations over 57 kilometers of track that are also mainly above ground with a wide station spacing. The East-West line serves Tuas, Jurong, the Central area, and Changi Airport. Both the North-South line and East-West lines operate on standard gauge tracks with 750-volt DC third rail power. The Northeast line was the system's next rail line, and it opened in 2003. The line has 16 stations over 20 kilometers of track, making it much denser in terms of stop spacing than the original lines. The Northeast line, as it turns out, also has a number of unique honors. It's the only line which operates with overhead power, perhaps due to problems encountered with the wire system, which unlike many tunneled systems with overhead power does not use a rigid overhead power system. It was also the first fully automated line on the MRT system, and the system's first entirely underground line, something which we'll see is a bit of a trend. The Northeast line operates on 1500-volt DC overhead power and standard gauge tracks, but you probably expected that. Following the Northeast line came the Circle line, which, in a change of form for the system, had substantially lower capacity. The line first opened in 2009 and has 30 stations over 35 kilometers of track, and despite its name, does not form a complete circle, but we'll talk more about that later. Much like the Northeast line, the Circle line is automated and entirely underground, though it reverted back to 750-volt DC third rail power again on standard gauge tracks. Akin to the original MRT lines, the Circle line features a branch which connects to Dhoby Ghaut. At the end of 2013, the MRT opened its next line, the Downtown line. Creative names are not necessarily the strong suit here, but I live in a city with a line called Line 1, so I'll try not to judge. The Downtown line is a 41-kilometer line with 34 stations, making it the densest of all the MRT lines in terms of stop spacing. The Downtown line is quite unusual in its topology. There are 2 legs branching off to the northwest and east and a loop around the downtown core, but no easy connection allowing travel from branch to branch. Once again, the Downtown line is fully automated and fully underground, and operates on standard gauge tracks with a 750-volt DC third rail. The latest line of the MRT system to open is the Thompson East Coast Line, which just opened in January 2020. The Thompson East Coast Line currently consists of 9 stations over 17 kilometers of track, more in line with the original 2 lines than the more recent Northeast, Circle, and Downtown lines. If the line feels a little odd, that's because it's opening in several phases, of which several are already under construction but not open, and I'll break that down later in the video. Going to really sound like a broken record here, but once again the line is automated and fully underground and operates on 750-volt DC third rail and standard gauge track. Wow, Singapore loves its tunnels. So that's the MRT as it is today. I didn't spend much time focusing on it, but the MRT is one of the most interconnected systems of its size in the world, with interchanges galore, particularly in the space encircled by the Circle line, and as it turns out, the MRT isn't the only way of getting around Singapore on the rails. Singapore also has an LRT. No, not that kind of LRT. Okay, also not that. Okay, seriously, can we stop calling everything LRT, please? In all seriousness, the Singapore LRT lines are really better described as automated people movers, sort of akin to the Metro Mover in Miami. These lines are designed to cover massive swaths of high-rise public housing with frequent reliable connecting service to MRT stations. There are currently 3 automated people movers of this type in Singapore. The first line to open was the Bukit Panjang line in 1999. This line is 7.5 kilometers long and features 13 stations. This line provides connections to the North-South line and the Downtown line, and has had a lot of safety and reliability problems throughout its lifetime, some of which pertain to its rolling stock, which was shared by, you guessed it, the Miami Metro Mover. Fortunately, the line is planned to be completely upgraded in the coming years, so hopefully the line has a more positive future. The line operates using first-generation Bombardier Innovia APM technology. Next came the Sengkang line, which opened in two parts with an eastern loop opening in 2003 and a western one in 2005. The Sengkang is the first of two of what I would call iconic figure-8-shaped looping lines that really stand out on the MRT map. The line has 14 stations over roughly 11 kilometers of track, with transfers to the northeast line at its center point. This was followed by the Punggol line, which also has two loops. The eastern loop opened in 2005, while the western loop opened in 2014. Like the Sengkang line, there are 14 stations, though over a slightly shorter 10-kilometer route. As it turns out, both the Sengkang and Punggol lines are connected and share a depot adjacent to the underground Northeast Line Sengkang Depot, and rather than Innovia APM tech, these lines use Mitsubishi Crystal Mover technology as seen on the Eureka Moe line in Tokyo or the Macau LRT. With 6 metro lines and 3 neighborhood connecting people movers, this is Singapore's rail network as it is today. Of course, many projects are planned to extend and complete existing rail lines, while others seek to add whole new rail lines to connect new areas of Singapore and add capacity. Let's start by looking at planned extensions before looking at new planned lines. The first planned system expansion to open will be the Thomson East Coast Line's Phase 3, which is set to take the line to the central area for the first time, with a terminus at a new station adjacent to Gardens by the Bay, an incredibly cool nature park adjacent to Marina Bay. This phase of the Thomson East Coast Line parallels the North-South Line and should provide relief and redundancy to it. Phase 3 is currently set to open in 2022 and will contain 13 stations. If you're wondering why so many lines run through the Marina South area, as it's known, plans call for massive densification of the district in the future, and massive rail capacity will underlie all of that development. At the moment, the area is surprisingly empty besides the Marina Bay Sands, Garden by the Bay, and the Marina Barrage. This will be followed up with the further Phase 4 extension of the Thomson East Coast Line to Bayshore with an opening set for 2024. This phase will run close to Singapore's southern coast while providing relief and redundancy to the east leg of the East-West Line. Phase 4 will contain 7 stations. Also in 2024, the Northeast Line will see a one-stop extension northeast to Punggol Coast to serve new development. At the same time, the Downtown Line, which is already looking very loopy, will get a 2-stop southwestern extension from its eastern terminus. The following year, in 2025, the initial build-out of the Thomson East Coast Line will wrap up, with a 2-stop extension that will have it meet the Downtown Line at its new eastern terminus. Finally, in 2026, the Circle Line is set to be finally completed, with a 3-stop extension as part of its 6th phase. As mentioned earlier, Singapore is also building a number of new lines which will provide access to more locations across the island. The under-construction Jurong Region line will act a lot like the DLR in London, connecting the Jurong area with truly light metro-style trains which will be quite comparable in size to trains on the Vancouver SkyTrain. Also sharing similarities to the DLR, the Jurong Region line will operate a number of different services, owing to its complex layout, including a weird service that operates between the 3 termini on the main portion of the line, as well as a shuttle-style service from Tengah to Pandan Reservoir. Construction began in 2020, and the project is set to open in several phases throughout the late 2020s. An interesting project that will probably fly under the radar for many is the Johor Singapore Rapid Transit System. This is a 2-stop light metro akin to the Jurong Region line in scope, which will connect Johor, Malaysia to the Singapore MRT at Woodlands North Station on the Thomson East Coast Line. This project is set to open in 2026. There's also the currently in planning Cross Island Line, which will connect east-west across the center of Singapore before traveling south parallel to the east-west line in Singapore's west. The initial phase of the project is projected to open in 2030 with 12 stations. Of course, further in the future, even more projects are being discussed, but there's a chance they change substantially before they're completed, so I won't go into too much detail. The first is the eastward extension of the Thomson East Coast Line to Changi Airport Terminal 5, and then potentially to Tanah Merah by absorbing the airport branch from the east-west line. The next is a potential new branch of the east-west line taking advantage of the Gull Circle station to connect to 2S South. There are also future extensions of the Cross Island Line West and the Downtown Line North. Now, while Singapore may only have 6 lines and only 127 stations, the MRT has a shocking number of rolling stock models that read off like a list of global rail manufacturers. I'll break down the various models now, line by line. On the east-west and north-south lines, which use the same rolling stock for historical reasons of being intertwined, there have been 6 different models of rolling stock, but they all share some common elements, such as 750-volt DC third rail power, 6-car trains with 8 doors per car, and a length of roughly 140 meters, and a quite wide 3.2 meter width, all surprisingly similar to the rolling stock of the Toronto subway in size. All models also feature fully longitudinal plastic seating, which you might know I'm a fan of if you're a longtime viewer. The trains were also fully walk-through from the original order in the 1980s, which does not make me look favorably on the fact that so many systems in North America still do not have open gangways even on new trains. Shame on you, DC Metro. The first model introduced was the C151. This was built by Kawasaki and first introduced in 1987. Some trains have already been retired. Introduced in 1995 was the second train model, the C651, which was manufactured by Siemens. Again, some of these trains have been retired. In 2000, Kawasaki was back together with Nippon Sharyo, makers of my favorite local airport express train, with the C751B. These trains, like their predecessors, are starting to be phased out. It was over 10 years later before another new model of rolling stock was introduced in the form of the C151A, which was manufactured by Kawasaki and CRRC. This was followed up with the mostly similar C151B and C151C, which were again manufactured by Kawasaki and CRRC. Interestingly, the North-South line and East-West line are both fully automated and were converted from a legacy signaling system over the past decade or so. Fully automated operations began in the late 2010s, meaning these lines are some of the few, along with Paris Line 1, that have gone from manned to fully automated operation. This also means that if you're keeping track, the entire Singapore MRT is fully automated. The rolling stock on the Northeast line is much less complex with two models in operation, though as mentioned earlier, it's quite unique as it ushered in a number of firsts, including being the first automated rolling stock and the first overhead powered rolling stock on the system. That said, the trains on the Northeast line conform to roughly the same dimensions as the previously mentioned lines, with 6-car trains with 8 doors per car. Of course, as usual, trains have fully longitudinal seating. The first train model introduced on the Northeast line was the C751A from Alstom's Metropolis line, which operated from the opening of the Northeast line. These were followed by Alstom's C751C trains, which were first introduced in 2015. Like the Northeast line, the rolling stock of the Circle line consists of 2 models and have the usual features you'd expect. Fully longitudinal seating? Check. Walk-through carriages? Check. And full automation? Check. That said, the Circle Line's trains did revert back to third rail power, and instead of the usual 6-car trains, consist of 3-car units, which are otherwise very similar to the other rolling stock on the MRT, with 8 doors per car. The first model of train introduced with the line's opening in 2009 was the Alstom C830. These were followed up by the mostly identical Alstom C830C trains introduced in 2015 to supplement the original fleet. The downtown line took a similar approach to the Circle line with regard to rolling stock, with 3-car trains built to MRT standards. Only one train model currently operates on the downtown line and has since its inception. This is the C951, which is manufactured by Bombardier in partnership with CRRC. After years of adventures with manufacturers from all over for trains on new lines with the Thompson East Coast Line, the MRT returned to Kawasaki and CRRC for its latest trains, the CT251, which was introduced with the opening of the line in 2020, and is similar to the previous rolling stock in dimensions, but opted for a 4-car consist with 10 doors per car, as seen on the Hong Kong MTR. This train truly feels like the perfect model for a super high-frequency, light metro line. I'll also make a short mention of the trains that will be used on the Jurong region line. The trains, known as the CJ151, will be manufactured by Hyundai Rotem and will be fully automated and powered by third rail. They'll come in formations of 3 or 4 cars, and will have cars that are 18 meters long and 2.7 meters wide with just 6 doors per car. The flashy turquoise look of the trains is really nice too. Now, time to talk about the unique features of which Singapore, as you may have expected, has a ton. The MRT has had a big influence on rolling stock and metro development around the world, and has pioneered some pretty innovative stuff. The MRT, as you might have guessed, is the largest automated system in the world, with several of the longest individual automated lines to boot. Singapore is somewhat like Tokyo in that it has multiple fare cards including EasyLink and Nets FlashPay. EasyLink used to use the same snappy Sony Felica technology underpinning the Hong Kong Octopus card and Tokyo Pasmo cards, but nowadays it uses the same NFC standard as Nets, allowing interoperability between the two networks, with EasyLink dominating the transit space and Nets dominating everything else including retail, parking, and more. Of course, it's hard to talk about the Singapore MRT without making direct mention of the very similarly named Hong Kong MTR. Both networks started in the late 20th century, well if you ignore the original KCR that is, and they both have a handful of lines with numerous interchanges, as well as massive ridership, and both systems have clearly influenced one another over the years. Another thing Singapore was an early adopter on was congestion pricing. In fact, Singapore has the world's first electronic congestion pricing system known as ERP, or electronic road pricing, which consists of sensor bridges that charge drivers for driving in certain areas and during certain times. The implementation of congestion pricing reduced traffic in central areas and helped boost MRT ridership, and influenced cities like London to implement their own congestion pricing schemes. As is common in Japan and Korea, exits are numbered on the Singapore MRT, This is super useful for hyperlocal navigation, for example finding a restaurant or business near a station without having to rely on a street address, or for meeting a friend near a certain entrance, or for just navigating a giant station. Stations are also given unique numbers for each line that passes through them. This makes locating stations much easier regardless of language spoken, which is valuable in a highly multicultural city like Singapore, and would be awesome to see here in Toronto. Given how development and transit in Singapore go hand in hand, it may not surprise you to know that infill stations have already been built and many more are planned for the system. Such stations are often built as new areas develop and also help improve access to existing residential and commercial areas. Singapore was also the first metro system in the world to have platform screen doors, if you don't count people movers, which admittedly is a very rough line in the sand for me to draw given the video I made about people movers some time ago. That said, the heavy style of platform screen doors seen on modern metro systems around the world originated on the underground portions of the Singapore MRT, and now the system has them at every station, including above ground stations which had them retrofitted. If you're wondering what motivated the use of platform screen doors, remember Singapore is very close to the equator, and PSDs in underground stations enable air conditioning. As I mentioned earlier in the video, Raffles Place and City Hall have an awesome pair of cross-platform interchanges, but as it turns out, Gulf Circle Station, on the 2S extension of the East-West line, is also very unique, as it has the provision for a multi-level cross-platform interchange built in as part of an elevated station. Much like some national railway networks, the Singapore MRT operates on a franchise model, with two operators, SMRT and SBS Transit, operating the city's various MRT and LRT lines. SMRT operates the North-South line, the East-West line, the Circle line, the Thomson East Coast line, and the Bukit Panjang line, while SBS Transit operates the Northeast line, the Downtown line, the Sengkang line, and the Punggol line. This video is about the MRT, not buses, but hey, Singapore uses a lot of double-decker buses, and I figured I'd mention that because double-decker buses are awesome. Singapore also has two cable transit lines in the form of the Singapore Gondola, connecting Singapore with the resorts of Sentosa Island, and the Sentosa Cable Car, which provides transportation on Sentosa. Connections to the Singapore Gondola can be made from Harbourfront Station. Now you might have noticed following the original two MRT lines, Singapore decided to start burying all of its new rail lines, and this is the source of lots of interesting facts. For one, a number of stations are designed as bunkers, deep underground with hardened metal doors and reinforced concrete. These are also present on underground stations on the older lines as well. Not only were underground lines insisted on for much of the system, but underground depots also were. The Circle line is having its underground depot expanded at a cost of over $1.5 billion, meaning a depot in Singapore is costing almost as much as a transit line in many countries. As it turns out though, Singapore has an even crazier depot project with a cost of $2 billion in the form of the East Coast Integrated Depot. This first of its kind depot will, like many MRT depots, incorporate a multi-level bus depot, but uniquely will also feature a multi-level stacked set of train depots with one level dedicated to the East-West line, one to the Thomson East Coast line, and one to the Downtown line. So, as you can see, the Singapore MRT is in many ways the most innovative metro system in the world. A system that does things many transit enthusiasts wouldn't even dare dream of, and that many cities will never be able to replicate. And the MRT is still continuing to grow, with more planned expansions than cities many times its size. Thanks for watching the video, and leave a comment down below on what details of the Singapore MRT you think I should discuss in a video next. See you in the next one.